So, hi everyone. Stunning people in the back. So my name is Olivier Grisel. I'm a software engineer at INRIA, where I'm working on machine learning library which is called scikit-learn, that doesn't do any kind of deep learning. Not yet, maybe a bit in a pull request or two, but not as good as piano or whatever. And so tonight I'm gonna introduce kind of the state of what is deep learning in 2014. So it will be like a review of recent development in the research. So a bit of a warning for people coming from traditional machine learning. So there are buzzwords, and there are also non-convex objective functions, so it's hard to optimize. So the outline of this talk is I'll start with the recent progress in computer vision. Then we will study how neural nets and gradient stuff have invaded natural language processing with word embeddings and recurrent neural nets for machine translation. Then we'll see a new application of combining the first two elements to do visual interpretation of images written as English text. And finally, we will explore recent development of application of deep learning to new areas that are not really traditional machine learning areas, like for instance, learning to play games, learning to write programs, learning to execute program, and also answer general queries in knowledge bases from natural language. So let's start with computer vision. So deep learning for computer vision is not something that is new. It's already started in the 80s and 90s, and the main researcher in that domain is Yann Lequin at New York. At the time he was working at AT&T, and invented the kind of neural nets that we call convolutional networks. And they are actually not real neural networks, because the individual units, like computing a convolution, is not something that looks like what is actually being computed by a neuron in the brain. But there are still layered architectures of activation functions going from the basic raw pixels that represent, for instance, a handwritten letter on a piece of paper, into some kind of higher level representation by going through these kind of operations that we call convolutions. And this was the first time that we managed to get this kind of deep architecture to be trained by gradient descent and compute something that was actually useful for a production system. So the individual units that we have in this architecture are computing what we call 2D convolutions. So the green cells are the pixels. So for instance, if you have a black and white picture, the zeros are black and one are white. And you have the kernel, the convolution kernel, which are the yellow elements. You can see that they are red weights, and you slide them through the space of the picture, and each time you compute the cell-wise multiplication, and then you sum all the results of the multiplication, and you get an activation in the pink cells there. And this is what we call a convol feature, which is the activation of the next layer, basically. And then we can take a nonlinearity on that, and we can do some kind of spatial averaging, max pooling operation, and you stage this kind of operation to get a network. So it was actually quite successful to do optical character recognition, especially for digits, and it was deployed in production to recognize the numbers on checks. So it was deployed in banks in the US. So you can see here handwritten digits that go through the field of view of the network. And here the prediction in red of the network. And here you can see the activation of the individual convolutional layers. And the last layer is a fully collected layer Actually, it's not displayed there. But you can kind of see the kind of contrast that are identified by the network and how that stabilized the prediction. Here is a second example where you have a 2 in the middle and the 1 is sliding from left to right in the field of view. And you can see that the answer is 12 at the beginning, then 4, then 21. And you have a question mark when the network doesn't really know. So it's kind of robust, but the problem was that at the time we couldn't generalize this to more complex problems like recognizing objects in natural images. And the main limitation at the time was the availability of labeled data sets, and also the time that it takes to train on bigger data sets. So until 2012, the traditional way to do computer vision for generate natural images, like for instance, if you want to do object classification, so here you have a picture of an animal out of many species of possible animals, for instance, and you want to classify whether or not it's a moth, un paresseux en français, and so the traditional way to do it until 2012 was first to have a first stage of operations which are fixed algorithms, so no training at this layer, that would scan through the image and extract for each area in the image some kind of higher level representation of the data. And so the algorithms are called SIFT, HOG, or SURF, typically. And then out of this intermediate representation, you train a traditional machine learning algorithm like support vector machines, linear logistic regression, and stuff like that. So linear models, so simple models. But in 2012, there was a challenge that was organized by the computer vision community. And for the first time, a team of a researcher from the University of Toronto participated in that competition, and they trained a big neural net, a convolutional neural net, so the same kind of stuff as Yann Lequin did in the past, but much bigger with new kinds of nonlinearities. And furthermore, they used GPUs, and they trained the model on a large data set because it has 1.2 million images, annotated images with 1,000 possible object categories. And they could train it on GPUs for a couple of weeks. And they won the competition by getting an error rate of 50%. And the second competitor in the challenge got 26%, and they were using the traditional computational vision architectures. And so you can see that it's a huge gap, a huge improvement with respect to the state of the art at the time. So now, because of that change, the new state of the art for computer vision is to train a deep architecture where the blue layer and the red layer are actually the same model. It's trained with backpropagation of the error from the top to the bottom. And you can still see the intermediate layers of the neural net as a way to extract a higher level representation of the data, so good features. And the last layer, it's some kind of logistic regression. So you can train that in one path. But compared to the traditional stuff, it takes more compute time, especially you need to use GPUs to train those kind of models. So because of that first success, the team at Toronto who did train that was hired by Google. And then in 2013, there was the same competition again. And this time, there were many more people participating in this competition who were using a convolutional neural net, and you can see that the error rate further decreased to 11%, and so basically they were like larger models. And what was interesting at this competition also is that Pierre Sermanet, so from the team of Yann Lequin in New York, trained a model which was called Overfit, and shipped the binary program to execute the model and the pre-trained model, because it's very expensive to train, but he provided the trained model to the community. and then people started to really reuse that kind of architecture. So as a consequence of the success of convolutional neural nets, Yann Lequin was hired by Facebook to found a new artificial intelligence lab at Facebook. So now, since we have the kind of pre-trained models that Pierre Sermanet provided as overfit, it's possible to reuse the activation of the last layers of that models to train a different classifier at the output. So you can reuse the intermediate feature extraction and adapt it to a new training set, to a new task that is still using natural images as the input, but you have a different kind of output. For instance, if you want to predict new classes that weren't part of the original dataset, it's possible to adapt the model, and it's much cheaper to do so. So there were a team of computer vision people in Sweden who did that and tried it on many different kinds of tasks, like for instance activity recognition, where you have a picture with people inside represented in the picture, and you have to guess whether the person is working at a desk, having a coffee, shaking hands, or sleeping, or whatever. And so it's a much higher level task, but they could reuse the pre-trained model for the first part and just adapt or fine-tune the last layers and get state-of-the-art results. So this team of people, they were actually a traditional computer vision team. And so based on that experience, they decided that nowadays CNN, so convolutional neural nets, are the new baseline for computer vision. So you can forget about the past stuff. Another funny application of this is that you can actually use those nets to analyze the pictures, the photos that you can find on Instagram or Twitter. And so there was this startup called Jetpack who started to count stuff in pictures from several places, because you have the GPS annotation in the picture. So if you count the smiles in faces, and you can have a ratio of happiness by city, for instance, in the US. And they also did that to count the mustaches in pictures in bars and coffee shops, and you can rank them by hipsterness levels. And you can do that for lipsticks, for nightclubs, and you have the glamourness level of the nightclub. And so they did that for the cities. So the happiest city in the US is St. Louis. And you can see that New York and San Francisco are not very happy. Austin, New Orleans, and so on. So the company Jetpack was bought by Google afterwards. So in 2014, so now Google has many deep learners in their team. In particular, Pierre Sermanet has joined them in the meantime. And they trained a big model, which is called GoogleNet. And they reached 6.7 error rate. And so it's a new state of the art. And the second team did train the same kind of very deep neural net called VGGNet. And they trained like from 16 to 19 weight layers, so without counting the reuse and the max pooling layers. And they used very small convolutional kernels, but many of them. And they stacked several sequences of convolutional and ReLU layers before doing a single max pool operation. And they did supervised pre-training. That means that they first trained a small model, and then they inserted new layers with pre-initialized weights for the others, and that helped them train such deep architectures. And they are very nice because they also provided the pre-trained models. You can download them and run them with a library called Café, so you can reuse them to adapt those to a new computer vision task. So if you take the winner GoogleNet, there is a guy in Stanford who is a PhD student doing research on deep learning called Andres Karpathy. He spent a week training himself on this same task, so labeling images from ImageNet out of the 1,000 possible categories. So you have to learn about hundreds of species of dogs, for instance. and stuff that are not very natural to classify on a daily basis. And he evaluated himself at around 5% error rate. So you can see that it's very close to the performance. It's barely better than the performance of the best Google model at the time. I bet that now it's better. So he says that he thinks now that it will be very, very hard for humans to be as good as computer in a couple of years. And he says that he found the prediction of the convolutional net very, very robust. So we have a new state of the art for computer vision, definitely. So let's move on to a new application domain, which is about text and word embeddings. So word embeddings is a way to represent words from the English language into a vector space, high-dimensional vector space with 200 or 300 dimensions. So this way of representing the words for natural language processing is actually a quite old idea that started in the early 2000s, and where you represent the word with a fixed dimensional array, and you train a neural architecture to try to predict whether the word in the middle of a sentence in the context of 5 words is the correct or not. So you can take all the sentences in Wikipedia, you extract windows of 5 consecutive words, and you swap the word in the middle with a random word, and you have a negative example. And if you keep the original word, you have a positive example. And you train gradient gradient descent. You use gradient descent to train the weights of the parameters of the models. And then you get a vector representation for each possible word in the English language. So recently in 2013 and this year, people switched to simpler models, so not deep models but shallow models, linear models actually. And they trained them on a much bigger data set. So for instance, Google, the Google News corpus has 100 billion words. And they use higher dimensional data representations, like 300 dimensions or more. And there are also new kinds of models that are very close to matrix factorization that kind of reach the same level of accuracy. And they are very nice because the embeddings that those models extract are very successful at uncovering the semantic and syntactic relationships between the words without having to annotate manually what we are looking for, because we are just using Wikipedia. So, for instance, the kind of analogies that you can get is that if you take the encoding of the word king, the same for male and the same for female, you subtract male from king and you add female, and you do a first neighbor search in that space, and you will find the encoding of the word queen. So you can kind of see the relationship between the pairs of king-queen is the same as a male-female. You can do that for entities, named entities, like from a knowledge base. Like Berlin minus Germany plus France is approximately equal to Paris. And if you do that for verbs, you can identify syntactic relationships, like eating minus eat plus fly is flying. So if you represent those in a two-dimensional space, so you pick up, for instance, those 10 words, and you encode them, and then you PCA them into 2 dimensions, you can see that the relationship between man and woman, or sir and madam, or king and queen, empire and empiress, and uncle and aunt, is almost always aligned in the same direction and with the same distance. So it extracts this kind of semantic relationships, like the gender of a word, for instance. It also extracts syntactic relationships for adjectives. For instance, here you have the adjective, the comparative, and the superlative, and you can see that you have the same vectors between the pairs. And you can do that in parallel for English and Spanish. For instance, you just take the English Wikipedia and the Spanish Wikipedia, and you do the embeddings independently of one another, and you extract the relationships between a couple of words, and you can see that the structures, for instance, here we have numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you have approximately the same layout in Spanish. And if you do that for animals, you kind of have a translation, basically. If you align the two representation by a rotation, for instance, and you see a couple of relationships, then you can build a translation dictionary without having learned about the language at all. So it's very promising, and people started to actually use neural nets to do machine translation. But when you want to translate a full sentence instead of just a word, it's much more complex, because if you want to translate economic growth has slowed down in recent years in English into la croissance économique a ralenti ces dernières années in French, you need to find an architecture that is able to adapt to the sequence of words that has a variable length, and it's not necessarily the same size in the two languages. You can have more words in English or in French, and so on. So to have this flexibility with the size of the variable length of the input, you can use a different kind of neural net, which is called recurrent neural net. And you can actually use that to both encode the original sequence of words into a fixed vector, a fixed dimensional vector in some abstract space, and use the same architecture to decode and to find the sentence that has the highest likelihood of having that intermediate code. So in practice, you take the words in a sentence and you accumulate them into the memory of the recurrent net, and at some point you have a special word that doesn't exist in French or English. It's just a marker, and then you take the output of the model and you feed it back as input, and you get a decoded representation into a new language. So you do that, and you do gradient descent to train the model on a training set where you need to have the translation of many sentences, and you can actually get good results. So this was achieved by two teams, one team at Google and one team at Montreal, and they are actually here. This is the previous state of the art, which is a phrase-based statistical model. If you take, it's not there, but the traditional models, they were around 33. The kind of stuff that you can get open source on the internet is 33 plus score. And if you take the models by the people at Google, for instance, the LSTM unit, and you train a single one, just a pure neural net, you can get around a 30% blood score. And if you combine that with a special way to deal with the words that are not frequent enough to be in the parallel corpus, you can actually improve that. And if you build an ensemble of 8 such neural nets, you can actually reach the state of the art for a neural machine translation with neural net. So it's very likely that this kind of stuff is going to be deployed, or maybe is already deployed in Google Translate. So what is very interesting with this kind of architecture is that in the middle here you have a representation of the meaning of a sentence that is independent of the language, because you can train this kind of model for several pairs of languages, and you can force the model to use the same intermediate space. So, by doing so, you can have a look at the embedding that is used by the model. So here you have Mary admires John, Mary is in love with John, and Mary respects Jones. So those three words, they have 3 sentences, they have a similar meaning, but when you switch the object and the subject, you can see the same relationship, the same order, but in a different part of the space. So, and it's even more interesting here, where you have the sentence, I was given a card by her in the garden. In the garden, she gave me a card, and she gave me a card in the garden. So this is all the same meaning, but the ordering of the word is completely shuffled, but you can see that it's clustered in the same area. And if you switch the two agents, you can see that you have the same kind of structure, but in a different different area of the space. So this is very promising for natural language understanding. And it's actually even more interesting because you can combine several models with different modalities. So you can use the models for convolutional neural nets for analyzing images, and use the recurrent LSTM neural net to translate the embedding of the image into English, for instance. So this idea was found in parallel by 5 teams that published approximately the same paper at the same time in November. And so if you take the team from Stanford here, those are some examples of sentences generated for images. So here, a man in black shirt is playing the guitar. Construction worker in orange safety vest is working on road. 2 young girls are playing with a Lego toy. It's actually Lego. A boy is doing a backflip on a wakeboard. So it's actually not a wakeboard, but it's still a backflip. Maybe not a boy, I don't know. But yeah, it's very, very impressive. So maybe those examples were picked because they are actually good, but even though it's still very impressive. And what is very nice with this implementation is that it's actually Andrzej Karpati is one of the authors of this work, and he published on his GitHub account an open source implementation of that, and pre-trained models, so you can actually train it, reuse it without training. And they used for the image analysis, they used the VGGNet pre-trained models from Café from the last competition. ImageNet, and for the decoding for the LSTM part, for the language model part, they just use Python with NumPy and OpenBLAS. So it's very easy to get started with, if you want to have a look. So finally, let's have a look at new stuff that you can do with deep learning, and stuff that we didn't think were possible a couple of months ago. So, or years. First is an impressive demo that was done by a company, a startup called DeepMind, who demoed at NIPS last year, so it's already 1 year old, how they trained a deep learning model using a reinforcement learning algorithm that was combined with a convolutional neural net to use the raw pixel representation of Atari games from the 80s, or 90s, I don't know exactly. And they used that as the sensory input of the model, so it's very low level. And they gave the ability to the model to pick up actions using joystick actions or keyboard keys. And what they got as a feedback was just whether or not the score was improving, or if it was leading to an action that led to a game over, for instance. So this scalar signal was the only kind of reward that the model got, and sometimes the reward that you get is a consequence that is delayed in time compared to the sequence of actions that you did in the past. So it's a very, very hard task for a machine learning model. So they trained the CNN model using the Q-learning with an additional replay memory. And they did that for traditional games like Breakout. So Breakout is you have this sliding pad and you have the ball and you need to break the wall. And they did that also for a game where you have a submarine and maybe fishes or submarines, I don't know, and you can launch torpedoes. And it's from time to time you are to go back to the sea level to get some oxygen, otherwise you die. And in both cases, you can see that the model was able over time to have a good action value estimation and to make the right decision. So actually, I have a demo if the internet connection is good enough. So here. Oh, sorry. I have to switch back to. So here you can see the game playing Space Invader. So this was at the beginning, and after training, it's almost always, it's actually perfectly playing that each time it shoots, it kills one stuff, and it actually gets the high score stuff as well. So it's perfectly playing, and this algorithm is very, very generic because it knows nothing about the rules of the game. It discovers the rules of the games by itself just by trying and failing. And they did that also. Maybe I can move forward. So breakout. And you can see, so at the beginning it was failing. After a couple of 1 hour, it was already playing perfectly without losing very few times. And then it got better and better just after 2 hours of training. And if you wait a couple of hours more, something very interesting happens, is that the model discovers that if you start sending the ball in the edges, you can actually get the ball to move up, and it was much better doing that. So it discovered like very high-level strategies at that game. So it's kind of impressive because it's exactly the same algorithm that was able to solve all the 3 games without any kind of adaptation. Oops. So back to the slides. So as a consequence of this demo, Google bought DeepMind. And now that Google has most of the interesting people, maybe not all of them, they are trying to experiment with very new stuff, very weird stuff. In particular, they trained recurrent neural nets to map character representation of programs to string representation of the output. So you have the string representation of the program and the string representation of the expected output. And the model is actually able to learn some simplistic version of the Python interpreter, so of the logic of the Python program. So it's very limited. For instance, this is the kind of input and output that you get. So those are strings, and the expected output is that, and the model was able to predict it. It's easy to understand, but it's not that trivial. And it's able to deal with some simple loops, but sometimes you get errors, and the errors that you get is often a digit that is wrong, but not necessarily the intuitive digit. And it's not very easy because you have to remember that the model doesn't care about the alphabetical order. It sees something like this. It doesn't have any a priori knowledge of what is a token in the programming language. So it's learning the programming language just by seeing examples. Also at the same time, other people in DeepMind, they did neural Turing machines, which is basically the same kind of recurrent neural nets, but this time you train them with the input and output of a program, and you expect the model to learn how to program to generate the output for a specific input. And how they did that, they used an explicit memory, a tape, which is why they called it neural Turing machines, where in a traditional Turing machine you have the input and an output, which can be a single tape actually, and you have a controller, which is a finite state automaton. And you can have an additional tape for the internal memory. And the finite state automata controls when you read and when you write at which location. And in that case, they replaced the controller by a neural net with a LSTM unit. And you can compute the gradient of that beast and then use gradient descent to train, to program. And it was able to actually do some stuff like copy and repeat, where you have an input and you have to repeat the output several times. And the model was actually able to do that. And they were also able to do just copy the memory or count the number of diagrams in binary format. Or they can also do, with some success level, sorting the data. So finding a sort algorithm, which is not trivial at all. And at the same time, a team at Facebook did approximately the same, using so recurrent neural nets with explicit memory management. But they didn't use them for abstract machines, but to solve a concrete problem, which is to answer queries on a knowledge base. And it made it possible for the model to actually answer queries on words that were not part of the original training set. So for instance, this is the kind of data that they use to train the model. So those are generated sentences like, Joe went to the kitchen, Fred went to the kitchen, Joe picked up the milk, Joe traveled to the office, Joe left the milk there, Joe went to the bathroom, where is the milk now? And the model answered the office, and where is Joe in the bathroom? And what is even more impressive is that you can use that with new names in the queries. So if you replace Joe and stuff by new names, you can tell the story of Bilbo and Frodo and Gollum, and where is the ring and so on. And at the end, where is the ring in Mount Doom? Where is Bilbo now in Grey Heavens? And where is Frodo in the Shire? So it's quite impressive. So some concluding remarks. So you can see that deep learning is now state of the art for many computer vision tasks. It's also state of the art for speech recognition, as we've seen previously. So initially just for the acoustic model, and now it's used for the whole acoustic model plus language model and the full stack. It's very recently state of the art for machine translation, and for Q&A it's as good as previous models. And now you can also see that the researchers are combining different models for different modalities, like caption generation, and trying to explore how to use recurrent net to address like more higher level tasks, like general artificial intelligence tasks like playing at games, or using that for reinforcement learning models and so on. So that's it. Thank you very much.